edition of the program, we shall examine the strategic value or otherwise of a proposed foreign defense pact with Nigeria. Last week, some prominent Nigerians and civil society groups wrote an open letter to President Bola Ahmed Tinubu and the leadership of the National Assembly, cautioning against being pressured by the United States and France to host their military bases in Nigeria following their rejection or ejection from the Sahel region. According to the letter, the American and French governments have allegedly been lobbying and pressurizing Nigeria alongside other Gulf of Guinea countries to sign new defense pacts that would allow them relocate their troops expelled from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to the Gulf of Guinea states, with particular preference for Nigeria. The authors of the letter contend that there are indications that the Nigerian government may be favorably disposed to the desperate lobby of the US and France to accept the proposed defense pact. This, they warn, would have wide-ranging implications for the defense and internal security of the country, as well as compromise the sovereignty and independence of Nigeria. They refer to two previous attempts, one in the 1960s with the controversial Anglo-Nigerian Defense Agreement and then in 2001 when the US tried to get Nigeria to sign a military cooperation agreement with Nigeria that were roundly opposed and rejected by Nigerians. Now, what are the likely geopolitical strategic implications for Nigeria and other countries of the Gulf of Guinea? How will such a pact impact Nigeria's foreign relations, especially with its neighbors? What have been the experiences of countries that hosted US and other foreign military bases in the past and or are still doing so? Is the US and France seeking a counterbalance to the growing presence and influence of Russia in the Sahel region? And how much detail of this proposed defense pact do Nigerians actually know? This is the focus of our discourse this Monday, and my guest is one of the authors of that open letter, Professor Jibril Ibrahim, a senior fellow of the Center for Democracy and Development, CDD. Thank you so much for finding the time to join us, Prof.
It's always a pleasure, Imani.
It's good to have you again.
Yes, I've been here for some time, yes.
Great. So, what would you say informed this open letter? And why is it an open letter? You could have, given the caliber of persons who signed that letter, you could have had access to the president and to the leadership of the National Assembly. Why did you decide to make it an open letter?
So that the president will get to read it. You know, what people don't realize is that the president of this country is completely shielded by a coterie of people around him and doesn't get to hear what Nigerians are saying. So by doing an open letter, getting people to talk about it, finally it will get to the president that Nigerians are getting concerned about this problem. And at that point, we do hope he'll ask for the letter to read it. So that's the basic tactics. But I think the main issue for us is that we do know there have been these moves to get Nigeria to agree, and there hasn't been any public discussions about it. What should have happened is that the government should have maybe made it an issue for the National Assembly to debate whether or not such a pact would be agreeable to Nigerians. And based on that, we as citizens can get to come in and give our views. But that's not happening, and it's not happening for a specific reason. In all the countries the United States has signed this type of pact, it has always been a secret pact. when the government in Niger published the pact they had with the Americans, one of the things they pointed out was that the American government insisted that the parliament in Niger must not be allowed to see the agreement. Only the president of the country would know about it. And that for us is quite frightening because we believe in open government. We believe that all our institutions must play their relevant role, and that therefore this type of pathway that leads to secrecy isn't the right one to follow.
Now, given the kind of constitution, the presidential system of constitution that we operate, could the executive or the president in this case alone have signed such a pact without passing it through the legislature, through the National Assembly?
Absolutely not. He doesn't have the powers to do that. These are things that commit the country on a long-term basis, so it has to go to the National Assembly. And I think that's part of the point we're making, that let's follow the correct path. If this thing is to be discussed, let it be on the table of the National Assembly, and let Nigerian citizens also have a say in it. We don't want to allow any risk of some secret deals happening that nobody knows about.
Is your concern related to the fact that sometime in 2001, there was almost such a military pact, which then President Olusegun Obasanjo was almost getting into or signing before the military high command at that time decided not to, to oppose it, as it were?
Exactly. The 2001 incident would have proceeded without National Assembly having an opportunity to discuss it. But the luck at that time was that General Malu in particular, who was the head of the army, was very vehemently opposed to it and came out and openly challenged the president and said, this is a red line. Nigeria, way back in the 60s, rejected such a deal. We cannot now in the 2000s say we are accepting ceding part of our sovereignty as a nation to a foreign power.
Now, let's talk more about the pact itself. We are yet to see the details of that pact, if it exists. Nobody knows so much about it. You just talked about the one published by Niger and all of that. Why, in the first place, do you think that the US and France are seeking bases in the Gulf of Guinea and particularly in Nigeria?
Well, because we follow international developments. First of all, the government of Niger expelled 1,500 French soldiers from their country. After that, they expelled 1,100 American soldiers from their country, who are just about to get them expelled. These two governments have a close ally in Chad and decided they can move some of them to Chad. But there was the problem of the geographical location. For a lot of the coverage they want to do of the Sahel, Chad is a bit too far to the east, and they would have preferred something closer to the central Sahel. But then their big shock was Chad itself started talking with the Russians, which, as you know, has become some sort of frightening spirit for the Western powers about a possible military agreement between Chad and Russia. So now these countries are worried that what if Chad goes the way of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso? So that's where we are in terms of geopolitics. Meanwhile, the Americans and the French need to find out where they can relocate some of their troops. Of course, the French have agreements with Senegal, they have agreements with Cote d'Ivoire. They actually have military bases there. And the United States is a bit left in the lurch in this situation because they don't have those agreements. And we do know in the current edition of Jeune Afrique, there is a revelation that the United States has already signed this agreement with the president of Cote d'Ivoire, and they are likely to set up a base in the north. We do know that in Ghana, there was a proposed agreement that the president of Ghana actually sent to the National Assembly. And the National Assembly in Ghana is debating it, whether or not to accept it. And of course, we know they've been talking to Nigeria. We have not seen any agreement. We don't know whether they've reached an agreement. So what our letter is doing is more of a precautionary move, that we know these discussions are ongoing. Please stop it. It's not something that is in our national interest. We should avoid such a retrogressive step that will take us really far back than what we should be doing as a country today.
Given the location of Nigeria in the Gulf of Guinea, what is its strategic interest or value, as it were, to the Americans and to the French? Knowing that the French have military bases in some of these other West African countries, Cote d'Ivoire and the rest, as you say. But, I mean, why the preference for Nigeria?
Well, I think the first issue is that Nigeria and its three other neighbors in the Lake Chad Basin already have an insurgency that has been going on for the last 12 years. And the Americans feel they have a stake in that. And they want to be able to monitor closely what is going at that level. But I think the basic strategic interest of the United States is that some of the terrorists operating in what they call the triangle area, that's the border between the three countries of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, are also terrorists that have hit American interests in the past, and the United States is monitoring them and trying to get some of them. In fact, the reason why they set up the largest drone base of the United States in Agadez in northern Niger was precisely to be targeting those terrorists in the Sahel. But the issue about that work, it should normally be a good thing that they are monitoring and targeting terrorists. But what the military governments in the three countries have said is that while the United States has these bases and have been monitoring for 12 years, they never share their intelligence with the military in these three countries. And the countries themselves do not benefit anything from having these American bases gathering intelligence and sometimes sending drones to kill their enemies. That it should have been a partnership in which both sides benefit from the intelligence. And since they have no benefit, then they don't see why they should allow them to continue to stay in their country. So in that context, our concern will be, isn't it a real risk for Nigeria to accept to take over such a bad deal in which we don't benefit anything from the presence of the Americans, and they just use our land and our location to pursue American interests only?
So for you and for the rest of the signatories to this letter, the major concern is that Nigeria could become a base for the Americans, a springboard for which they could then operate in the Sahel and the Gulf of Guinea region without any significant benefit to the host country.
Exactly. That's really our concern. And you know, the fact of the matter is that we've all studied some international relations. You know, the Americans consider themselves as the hegemons of the world, in which countries must obey them or be dealt with because the Americans have might. And we know that there are transformations happening in international relations, and there are also traditions. To start with the traditions, since the 1962 issue was settled with Great Britain, the position of Nigerian foreign policy has always been one of non-alignment, that we are not going to be in one camp or the other, but that we'll pursue our own interests. And we are supportive of that foreign policy stance Nigeria has always taken. And when you start accepting one side to set up a base in your country and the other side doesn't have a base, then it means you are now shifting from non-alignment to taking a strategic alignment with one of the world powers. But we also feel that at this time the world is changing. All over the world, people are now challenging American hegemony. People are saying these people just impose their might for their own interests all over the world, and there are no benefits for the countries involved. Why is it that at this time, when more and more people are coming to the realization that there are no benefits in terms of allowing American bases, that we should even consider it? What I think needs to happen very urgently in this country, the president should come out openly and say, we are not ready to offer any base to any foreign country, that our sovereignty is precious to us, that I, as president, have sworn to defend the interests of this country, and that therefore this discussion shouldn't even proceed. That's really our hope and prayer.
Now, some would argue, Prof, that such military pass would or is capable of enhancing the Nigeria's internal defense systems, its security, and like you said, helping to show off, as it were, terrorist groups and organizations that have been troubling this country for a while. Now, so, and maybe hopefully help to capacitate the Nigerian military by the establishment of such military bases in Nigeria. So if that is an argument that the school of thought is pushing, for you, is that not tenable enough for a reason why we should, or Nigeria should look at the proposal?
Well, our position is that Nigeria already has military cooperation with the United States, and some of that is very useful. You recall some years ago, Nigeria purchased this Tucano aircraft from the United States based on an agreement with that country. And those aircrafts have been very, very useful for the Nigerian military in the fight against terrorism. And we completely support such cooperation. But that cooperation was done on the basis of a commercial agreement. You recall when that time Trump approved it, we had to pay for those planes in advance, 3 years in advance, before they even produced the planes. And then before the planes were delivered, they trained the personnel that will be using the equipment in the plane. So that's perfectly normal. All countries have such military cooperations with other countries, and we have nothing at all against that. But where we see a red line is allowing them to set up a military base. Why do we say we see a red line? When the government of Niger published their agreements with the Americans, for example, one of the items in the agreement is that all the personnel coming in will not, the Nigerian government will not be informed. They'll just come straight from the airport. We wouldn't even be given a list of who they are. They go straight to the base. All the equipment they are coming with, they won't tell us what they are, and we have no right of inspection. Thirdly, our military will have no right to enter those bases to see what they are going on. In other words, it's creating a sovereign American space in Nigeria that's engaged in hostile action against neighboring countries. We as a country have a stake that we shouldn't allow a foreign power to come and occupy space in our country and be engaging in hostile actions against other countries, because that's a real risk to our own strategic interests, because we also need the friendship of some of our neighbors. And the issue about the terrorism factor is that if the Americans are fighting terrorists, that's always good for the world. But if you are going to fight terrorists just on your own and on the basis of your own assessment, and you don't share your intelligence with our own intelligence and defense services, then we are unable to benefit from the extra intelligence you are able to gather, and that therefore we don't have any strategic interest in your being there because there's nothing we would be gaining out of the process.
Uh, let's look at a scenario like this, Prof. There are a number of countries in the Gulf of Guinea that, as we know now, have been approached by the Americans and the French. What happens if one of these other countries accepts and signs this defense pact and allows the Americans and the French to construct and operate their military bases in any of these countries, even if Nigeria does not agree to such a proposal?
Well, our position is that we don't have powers to stop our neighboring countries entering in agreements they may wish to enter. But we know that it's not in the strategic interests of the region, because we all belong to a regional organization, ECOWAS. ECOWAS is in a moment of great difficulty, facing a lot of challenges following the return of coup d'etat in the region. 4 of the 15 countries in West Africa have already temporarily left the organization following the coup d'etat. Now, if other countries now start deals with, say, the Americans and the French, all that will weaken ECOWAS, which is our own regional organization, and weaken all of us collectively. So if that happens, it will be very unfortunate. It wouldn't be in our interest. And there, I think the right thing to do is to activate our own diplomacy to persuade our neighbors not to follow such a path of signing a deal with these world powers.
Well, what would you consider to be a possible consequence or consequences of our refusal, of Nigeria's refusal to sign such a proposed pact? In terms of bilateral and multilateral relations.
Well, we've refused to sign such a pact in the past, and nothing has happened. We've continued to relate with them, and they will be upset with us if we refuse to sign, but that's fine. They can continue to be upset. What's important is that we should always pursue our own interests and make sure that the concerns of third parties is not what determines what we do, that our own action, our own policy should always be based on our own strategic interest, and we should be laser focused on Nigeria and West Africa's strategic interests on this matter.
What would be Nigeria's, or what should be Nigeria's strategic interest at this point in the West African sub-region? Like you said, the ECOWAS as an organization is in turmoil right now, with 4 of the members opting out temporarily. Hopefully, maybe they will be persuaded to return. But as the biggest of in the 15-member organization, what do you think should be Nigeria's strategic interest at this point in time? What should it be driving?
Don't forget that part of the crisis that was precipitated in West Africa is when there was a decision by our own ECOWAS leaders to use force to reverse military rule, first and foremost in Niger, and subsequently in the 3 other countries that have had transition to military rule. That decision was based on the strategic policy options of ECOWAS, which is that all West African countries will operate a democratic model of open governance, and this is based on the supplementary protocol on democracy and good governance that we signed in 2001. So the decision to use military force is a strategic mistake in the sense that you don't issue a threat and then later find out you cannot act if your bluff is pulled off. And what these 3 countries did was that they called the bluff and said, come and attack us. We are ready for you. Our armed forces are organized. And then the other countries in ECOWAS realized they didn't really have the capacity and the logistics in particular to attack these countries and remove their leadership. In any case, it's never a good idea to think, oh, I'll go to their country, remove the military that has taken over, bring back democracy and all that. You know how you start a war, but you never know how you end it. So I don't think our own strategic thinking in West Africa and ECOWAS was the best. So mistakes were committed, and that's part of what we're paying for. So part of the fallout of this is that the United States and France have suffered from the coming into power of the military in these countries, who mobilize their own people on the basis of national sovereignty and chase them out of the country. So if we in West Africa then allow them an opening to come into our own countries, then we will be creating a situation of deeper division in West Africa, in which some countries have discovered the terrible effects of French and American hegemony and are fighting them off, and some other countries are accepting these hegemons back into their countries, and therefore deepening the divide that has already emerged in West Africa. That would be a really terrible outcome.
All right. Professor Jibril is my guest, and we're looking at proposed military pact with states in the Gulf of Guinea. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
Are critical, germane to Nigeria's democratic process.
Politicians can only be seen maybe on television by judges. They should not intermingle, because once you intermingle, then you destroy the systems.
When the personalities are big, important to national discourse.
When you reach certain stage in power and you demonstrate arrogance to the extreme, there's no other thing that will happen to you other than to fall.
When the developments are seemingly complex, confounding like a thousand-piece jigsaw, that's when we require bold, sound, and analytical minds to help put the pieces together. Jigsaw with Benga Arileba, now showing Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 p.m. on AIT. Jigsaw, demystifying the issues.
The Nigeria of our dream, the Nigeria we need, is the united, indissoluble, and cohesive Nigeria which guarantees equity, fairness, justice, and prosperity for its citizens. That is our focus on people, politics, and power. It is fresh, insightful, impactful. It's a must-watch. People, politics, and power on AIT.
Thank you so much for staying with us. Professor Jibril Ibrahim, a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development, is my guest, one of the authors of an open letter to the Nigerian president and the leadership of the National Assembly on a proposed military pact between Nigeria, France, and the United States. Prof, now in that letter, you also spoke about potential economic, social, and environmental impact of siting of military bases in any country, and particularly in Nigeria. Tell us more about that. What are those likely consequences or impact for the host communities?
I think the first issue is the host country doesn't know what they are bringing in. In Niger, for example, they have drones. And the authorities in Niger are complaining they don't know, are some of those drones nuclear, have they nuclear material? How harmful will it be to their own environment? the countries are simply left to speculate since they are not allowed to know what is brought in. The fear there is that dangerous materials for the environment may be brought in, and the country that's hosting the facility would be harmed without even knowing what was brought in and what it is doing to its environment. The second issue is the legal immunity in these agreements. The United States insists that their personnel are not subject to local laws. And there have been many incidents in Japan in particular, but also recently in the United States, you recall, where one of these military personnel kills a citizen of the country, and the person goes free because by this agreement, they all have the status of diplomats and are not subjected to local laws. What we've seen over the years in Japan, for example, is this military personnel going into towns and villages, relating with people, committing crimes, sexual assault, even many cases of murder. And at the end of the day, that community is terribly impacted, and there are no consequences or protection for the local community. The third issue is that these are self-contained bases where they come in, they fly in all their food, all the things they need. So they don't really interact with the local economy, and there are no specific benefits for the local economy. These are the reasons why we feel the environmental, social, and political impact of these bases are all negative. And there's no basis to think there could be any benefits coming out of it.
You also speak about possible increased cost of living in the localities where they operate. If they do not patronize the local economy, if they, as it were, seem to be self-sufficient in their own economy, how would that impact negatively on the local economy?
No, because they also engage in other activities. That's why I gave you the example of Japan, where they have their own food in their own bases, but the men in the base, for example, will go out to relate with women. And what they can use is the money they have, because they have a lot of extra dollars in their pockets. And that creates conditions that I think are quite bad for the society. I think there's an issue of, is it possible to draw an agreement that's equitable for both parties? That's really the issue on the table. In principle, it should be, but we do know that there is no country with which the United States has signed this type of military accord where these forces that do not have complete immunity from local processes and local law, where these bases are open to the countries that are hosting them, and where there is some sort of reciprocity in terms of the legal relationship between the two parties. So if these are things that can be addressed, fine, but we do know if they've refused reciprocity with Japan, with Germany, and with the UK, there's no way in which they will accept reciprocity with Nigeria.
With any African country, for that matter.
Absolutely, yes.
And then you also, I mean, the group also speak about your concern about the redirection of resources by the Nigerian government from such social services as education, such critical areas as healthcare and infrastructure, towards securing the military installations of these foreign governments.
You see, this is a general policy advocacy we've been engaged in for a very, very long time. In fact, since the structural adjustment program days, where the Nigerian government has, for a very long time, turned its back from a focus on social programs, health and education in particular, mainly on the advice and directives of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And we feel we are seeing this type of thing continue very much with the present government. You recall when this government came into power and it announced removal of fuel subsidy, it removed controls on the dollar and all that. What it said is that it will immediately launch palliatives where the social suffering of the people will be reduced. It's almost 1 year now and nobody has seen these palliatives. What are what are you doing to address the social impact of your specific policy? So we do feel that at each point it's important to remind government that social programs are important in a country that happens to have the largest number of poor people in the world and where poverty is both broadening and deepening in your country, and in which specific services have really declined considerably. Take health. Not only have we not been losing, not only have we lost a lot of our health personnel who've moved on, who we have trained and they've moved on to serve other countries, but the general inflation in the country has risen the cost of medical care to such a high level that even we, the elite, are finding it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to pay for medical care. And we feel our government at this point in time should focus on what can we do to help the suffering of Nigerians. Nigerians are suffering greatly. The conditions of life are very difficult at this point in time. And the social scene in Nigeria, especially health and education, are the most bleak as they have been in our history.
Prof, let me take you to two related issues. One has to do with the growing influence and presence of Russia in the Sahel region. There are those who think that while rejecting the hegemony of the Americans and the French, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have simply replaced that American hegemony with another hegemony, which is the Russian hegemony. If looking at it from that angle, how much threat does that pose to Nigeria's security, knowing that these countries are just by the borders?
Well, I will agree with that analysis that the strategic mistake made by the three countries is simply to replace French and American bases with Russian bases, and that therefore their sovereignty is simply shifting from the French and Americans to the Russians. I said earlier that for me, the entire foreign policy history of this country has been the principle of non-alignment, which means you must never allow your country to be under the hegemony of one or the other world powers. And that's what I have always supported. But to respond directly to their country, I think it does, it is a threat to us that basically we have a border of 1,600 kilometers with Niger, and if on the other side of that border there are Russians, then there are issues of concern. What if we do things that is not pleasing to the Russians? Wouldn't they be able to use their positioning in our neighboring country with whom we have a very long border to do us harm? So there are calculations on the strategic implications of this for Nigeria. And I'm really worried that I haven't seen the Nigerian government engage in a debate on our foreign policy options at this time when there's so much convulsion happening in the international system. There's been the war in Ukraine that has been going on. There has been this emergence of Russian forces in Africa. It's not just in these three countries, in Central African Republic, in the current crisis in Sudan. In a lot of these countries, the Russians have been coming in. And I think it is important for us as a country to start re-examining our strategic options in the contemporary world. There are new organizations emerging in the world today in which Nigeria is not a member. Is there a reason why we are not a member, for example? These are all issues on the table to consider.
So, is it possible that the Americans and the French are actually seeking a counterforce against the pressures, the emerging increasing presence of the Russians in these areas, and so they want a buffer, some kind of buffer?
No. The French and the Americans have always said this, that it's a direct threat to their interests that the Russians are moving into territories that were previously under their control. There was a public hearing in the American Congress where these issues were raised. Macron in France has raised that with his own National Assembly. So they are extremely concerned with what's happening, and they are planning their strategic moves. The former Chief of Defense Forces of the French Army, in a recent video, was saying that his country is planning that over the next decade, they'll be able to throw out the Russians and take back control of these countries that were in their orbit of influence. So there's a lot happening in international relations at this point in time. Strategic interests are being redefined. New forces are playing. And we haven't even mentioned China, which has become a major player in our continent, and which so far has concentrated itself on commercial issues. But clearly, China is not disinterested in the realignment of world forces and would become, in the coming months and years, a major player in our strategic arena of interest.
So finally, Prof, what are your thoughts on the developments in Togo? The constitutional reform in that country, the elections that were held last week, Monday, the results were released only yesterday, with the ruling party, the Nasingbe party, winning almost all the seats. I think 108 out of 113 seats in the national parliament, which will eventually give the president, the current president, an opportunity to continue in office for as long as he wants. And recall that these Sahelian states, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, one of the reasons they gave for pulling out of ECOWAS was the fact that they think that the ECOWAS has not been fair in the handling of issues like this, and that there are what they call democratic coups as opposed to military coups, but they are coups, as it were. And the ECOWAS happens to be just one of the countries that went to observe the elections in Togo.
Yeah, I think there's definitely lots of concern over these issues. The fact of the matter is that over the last almost 60 years, two people have ruled that country, Iadema the father and Iadema the son. So as we wait for the Holy Ghost, I think the consideration we have to give is that, is it correct that one family will permanently have overlord status over an entire country? And it's definitely wrong. The Togo issue has been on the agenda for a long time. I remember in 2005, when Iyadema died. And then his son, Four, took over power. Tanja was then the chairman of ECOWAS, and Obasanjo was in power in Nigeria. Obasanjo called Tanja, and they went off to Lome and told Four that, look, you have a constitution that says when the president dies, the president of the National Assembly takes over, not the son of the former president. So they forced him to step down and allow the National Assembly president to take over and then hold the election. But what happened was, because his family controls the whole mechanism in the country, he was able to significantly rig the elections and impose himself as the president. And since he came in, he's had term after term. There is a movement against tenure elongation in the country. He's just disregarded them. And when now he saw, having done all these constitutional changes, he couldn't continue in power, he then changed the constitution from a presidential to a parliamentary constitution so that he could now continue under a new so-called constitution. So this is really extreme manipulation, and it's unfortunate that ECOWAS has not been able to combat its own leadership using their positions in power to manipulate the machinery of government and stay perpetually in power. ECOWAS needs to develop the capacity to challenge that, or else its own reputation is at stake.
Thank you so much. Professor Jibril Ibrahim is a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. He's been our guest speaking about the proposed military pact between Nigeria and some Gulf of Guinea states and the United States and France, and what implications that has for Nigeria's security and defense systems. Thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure.
Welcome. All right, that's our program for today. Please join us again when we bring you a fresh edition of People, Politics, and Power. Bye.